The comments contained in this podcast do not constitute legal advice. The opinions herein are the opinions of the speakers and not the official opinion of the Hodgson Russ Law Firm. Hey there, tax fans. Welcome to State Tax Talks with me, your host, Joe Tantillo. I'm a tax attorney at the Hodgson Russ Law Firm looking to explore the nuances of state and local tax law. Here on the show, our goal is to keep tax informative, simple, and fun. So if you're ready to talk tax, turn up the volume and dive into this episode of State Tax Talks. Hey there, folks. Welcome to another episode of State Tax Talks with Joe Tantillo. I am looking directly into the hard cam because this is our first ever video episode, and I am super excited to be joined by some regular friends of the pod, Mr. Brandon Bourg and Mr. Drew Wright. Guys, thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Joe. Happy to be here on camera.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Joe.
We're all nice and spiffy and gussied up in our lawyer suits.
Not something I often do, Joe.
I know, now everyone can see us, so we have to look as professional as possible, unlike the sweatpants we usually sit in the studio.
That's right.
Yep.
Well, we're gathered here today, he says, as if we're about to give a eulogy, but maybe we are going to give a eulogy to New York's former resident taxpayers who have been calling us left and right in the wake of Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani's victory in the New York City mayoral race. A lot of folks have been reaching out to us because they are terrified that Mr. Mamdani is going to follow through on his promise of raising New York City resident taxes, and they would like to know what on earth do they have to do to get out of New York City and be tax residents somewhere else. We thought, what better occasion than, people freaking out over something that happened recently that might raise their taxes than to get together and have our first ever video podcast. Stared into the hard cam again for those of you listening at home, really emphasizing it. So, guys, this isn't going to be our normal interview-style podcast. I want to talk about this, just more like we would discuss it if we were chatting off camera and off microphone, because it's an interesting turn of events. We help taxpayers move every single day of the year when tax rates are not necessarily going to go up. But in light of what seems like it could be not an insubstantial hike of the city tax rates, I think it's as good a time as any to talk about New York's residency rules. And I guess in this case, New York City's residency rules, which are ostensibly the same as the state rules. If you have not listened to our podcast episodes on the general residency rules or the one that Drew and I did with Mark on common residency pitfalls, highly recommend you go listen to those, available wherever podcasts can be found. And you can get the nuts and bolts, but today's going to be more about just like the practicalities. Are these rates actually going to go up? Do people need to panic? And when's the right time to move if you're actually going to get out of there, because you don't want to wait around and see whether, Mayor Mamdani is going to actually raise these tax rates.
I mean, that's I think the best place to start, Joe, right, is like, is this actually going to happen? Because folks like us who work in this space every day, we hear crazy proposals coming out of, whether it's the city or New York State, pretty much every year, right? I think it was a couple years ago now that someone in the legislature introduced a bill that was going to, maybe similar to, I guess, to what California's proposing now, right? Mark-to-market assets and tax rich people in New York on that basis. And, just like with Mamdani's proposal, like people call and say, oh my God, is this going to happen? What do I do? Should I get out? And most of the crazy proposals like that never see the light of day, right?
Right.
Someone floats them, it hits the news, it scares people. They don't actually happen. This I think is a little bit different for a couple of reasons, right? Number one, we say it's a tax hike. What is it? I think he's proposing a 2% increase on people who make more than $1 million.
Yeah, that's right.
So, a lot of people are going to say, what's the big deal? 2% increase, that's nothing. The highest income people are paying tax to New York State and City at what now? Almost 15%?
Yep.
So you add 2%. 2% in a vacuum doesn't sound like that much, but it's 2% on top of almost 15, 17% state and local tax rate on top of, maybe as much as 37% federal.
Yeah, and if you make $5 million, $10 million bucks a year, that starts to add up really quickly into a substantial tax bill.
Yeah, I think certainly depends on the particular makeup of the taxpayer, but like some residents of New York City might be paying tax on more than half of their income at that point, right? And so I think there's a line for everyone, right? A lot of people called us when New York raised their rates a couple years ago, right? I mean, you think back to 2020, the highest New York State rate was, I think, 8.82%.
Mm-hmm.
Now the highest rate's 10.9%. So that was a 2% increase that went through New York's legislature. So, will it happen? For most of the proposals, my inclination is no, the craziest things aren't going to happen. This is a 2% raise in the rate. That's happened before, right? And in fact, the increases that went into effect whenever it was, 4 years ago, I think they were scheduled to sunset. They've been extended, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
that's right.
This is not unfathomable, right? It could happen. And we can get into the mechanics of how it has to happen. But, I think the first question is will it? I don't know. Most of the time, I'm inclined to tell people this crazy proposal will never happen. I don't know that you can say that for this one.
Yeah, and I don't pretend to know the inner workings of what's going on down at the New York City legislature or the state legislature and how these things actually come to pass at the end of the day. But I would imagine that, assuming the mayor has at least the support of everyone in his own party who's in the state assembly and, the state senate, those folks are going to get together and try to work with Albany to turn this into a reality. Now, whether there's enough of an appetite from upstate New York, who knows? There's definitely political feuds there to be had. But this is not a political show. This is more about whether we think this could get done, and it certainly seems like it is a real possibility.
Well, whether it gets done is decidedly a political question,
yes.
Right? So, I imagine there will be a lot of headwinds. He's just gotten through a difficult campaign and election where there were a lot of people trying to beat him, right? And he's won, and he's been pretty clear about what his main proposals are. So, I imagine there'll be lots of excitement to try to make those proposals a reality from people in city government. And for a lot of the things he's proposing, they might not need a lot of buy-in from anyone else, right? But that's where this personal income tax rate question is, I think, unique in the sense that the personal income tax rate is set by the state legislature. Mm-hmm. And my understanding is that right now it's currently set at a little under 4%. I don't think there's anything on the books that would allow them to raise it without approval of the legislature, right? So we got to pass a law basically to raise the rate, and then that law's got to be signed by the governor. And, that's where I think, you go and read the news, and certainly what the governor was saying during the, election season was that she would not support raising that rate.
Well, and she's got an election coming up at some point in the future and, certainly needs to be aware of whether she wants to agitate potential New York resident voters who are concerned about their tax rates.
Yeah. Well, and it's a fundamental policy question at the end of the day, right? Because, we look at these stats every year. What do we see in terms of population loss in New York? Who are the kinds of people leaving? What kind of impact does that have on the budget? The statistics keep repeating themselves in the sense that population loss year over year, I think this most recent year, New York was not dead last, but 49 out of 50th in terms of population loss, behind only Hawaii, where, taxes are also high, cost of living is also sky high.
Yep.
So clearly people are leaving, right? And one of the reasons, I don't think any of us would say that the only reason people leave are taxes, but one of the things that motivates people, especially people of high income, are taxes. And if you keep raising taxes, at a certain point you encourage people who have otherwise been inclined to stay so far to consider leaving.
Yeah, this is the piece that fascinates me. Is during the course of the election, there was a lot of discourse around whether people leave New York or just generally will move for tax reasons. And the Mamdani camp was generally advancing this idea that people don't move for tax reasons.
Yeah.
I can
he didn't call us.
He did not call us. I can say definitively, as the people in New York State who probably do the most tax residency work, people 150,000% move for tax purposes.
We're
absolutely, unequivocally will leave to pay lower taxes.
Yeah. we're 3 of 23 people in our group who do this work. And
Yes.
I think everyone in our group gets, I get now several calls a week, right, from people who are contemplating a change of residence. Whether they all do it or not, they don't. I talked to a guy at 1:00 this afternoon who was thinking about this. Can I move to Florida? Talked to him for 5 minutes. No, man, you can't move to Florida. It's not going to work. All right, well, I got a place in, out on the island. Can I move from city to state? Maybe, right? There's a feasible path there, but talked through it with him for 30 minutes. And at the end of the day, he decided, no, New York City's my home. It's not worth it to me. I don't really want to move, right? So it's not going to scare everyone away. There's plenty of those people, and I talk to them regularly, right? But lots and lots of the people that call us are people who can move. Do they want to? I don't know. Maybe all things being equal, they wouldn't. But all things aren't equal, right? We keep raising taxes. You talk about some of the other issues that the people we talk to will say are happening on the city level. And I certainly, very few of our clients are saying the only reason they're moving are taxes. Some of them are clearly motivated by that, right? I got a big transaction. But I would say for all of them, taxes are at least one of the most important considerations in why they're moving, right? So to suggest that it's not relevant, I think, we're uniquely positioned to judge that because this is the world we work in. But it's every call I have on someone who's considering a move, taxes are the relevant consideration.
So I'll say it one more time for the hard cam, for my TikTok moment. Do people move for tax reasons? They absolutely do. With that thought in mind, let's transition a bit to what it means then to actually move out of New York. Because it's all well and good to talk about, I want to move, I'm afraid of the tax hike, the ifs and the possibilities and the unknowns. But what we do know is that New York aggressively audits these kinds of tax residency changes. And if they do hike the rates up, I can suspect that they're certainly not going to be less aggressive or less active in the audits. In fact, I would suspect that they will look at these people even harder, because they're partially concerned with revenue that they are leaving on the table, and they're going to audit a change of domicile thoroughly in order to make sure that people have done what they are supposed to do under the law to actually get out.
Is it only partially? I don't know. They're kids. Yes. Look, the audit program's a revenue generating program for them, right? I think we got updated audit statistics earlier this year in response to a Freedom of Information law request, and it looks pretty similar to what it did the last time we got it, right? You look at a 5-year snapshot, and it's like $1 billion in revenue generated by auditing former residents. Mm-hmm. And so from my perspective, they're not going to stop doing that. And if the rate goes up from roughly 4% to roughly 6% on the highest income people, it just makes the impact of a change of residence more significant, right? Yep. There's theoretically more revenue to chase. Yeah,
and I suspect that if something like this rate hike were to go into effect, they're going to use the political momentum that they have right now. Mr. Mamdani has a mandate from the New York City electorate.
A mandate?
A mandate. Exactly. He's promised them various policy points that would require additional government funding, which in theory is going to be financed by the additional revenue collected by these rates. So this is something that I think if it's going to happen, it's probably going to move fast. I would suspect them to start pressuring for something to be included in maybe the next budget bill, which usually comes down from Albany around April, March each year, maybe May. And I doubt that it would be something that would be in effect for, tax year 2026, but maybe 2027, maybe 2028, it starts to become a reality. So, the planning that we talk about in the residency context becomes something that should probably be happening sooner rather than later. Because if part of this discussion becomes a review of residency audits generally, them talking about, hey, we're going to raise the rates, we're going to take a look at how many people we're auditing, we want to make sure that we suspect people might leave as a result of these rate hikes, you got to make sure everything is buttoned up. There's a lot of traps that come into play when trying to change domicile. And I mean, how many phone calls do we get of people saying, I went to Florida, changed my license, and I got my 6 months in a day?
Yeah, absolutely. And, whether or not the rate hikes are going to be implemented, there's certainly a lot of dollars at play. And so, folks that are thinking about planning to move out of New York City, whether it be given the recent election results or, for any reason really, are going to have to be tactful in all the steps they take and, planting their flag in Florida and sufficiently abandoning their New York City domicile.
Yeah, I mean, our partner Mark Klein says it all the time, right? I mean, every time I sit down in front of a group of people to talk about residency with him, he starts with that kind of narrative. It's not 183 days. It's not getting your driver's license, and that all seems silly and second nature to us. But the call I had this afternoon, it's the guy I mentioned before. He lives in New York City. And he's like, I was talking to my friends. They said they went to Florida. They spent 184 days in Florida. They got their driver's license. They registered to vote. They said it works for them. Why won't it work for me? And I said, well, did you ask your friends if they've been audited? and he said, oh, yeah, no. They, come to think of it, they don't make as much money as I do. They probably wouldn't be audited. And so what works and what doesn't, right? What are the traps? Like everything we always contemplate is in the context of, how do I ultimately prove to a New York auditor that I've actually changed my residence? Mm-hmm. If you don't get audited, anything works, yes. Right? Like, I moved to Florida, I file a tax return that says I'm a non-resident of New York. If no one comes and asks me to prove it, it's worked, right, by definition. But certainly that's not the kind of advice we can give in the planning context, right? If we're talking to someone who wants to make a move to save some tax dollars here, we have to be anticipating an audit and say, here are the actions you need to take to be compliant with the law, right? High burden of proof. You have to do these kinds of things to be able to win your case.
I think especially because domicile is it's the opposite of mechanical, right? Like it is by definition a subjective test, and trying to help new clients or even sometimes, accountants understand this is not a check the box kind of legal analysis. You have to create real lifestyle change, which means that this isn't something that you can easily do after the fact. I mean, we come into a lot of audits after the fact where there was not necessarily planning work done beforehand, where people are trying to, make their change of domicile argument without having given it a lot of forethought. People it's the classic, we went to Florida, we spent some time there, we got a license, we registered to vote, et cetera. Not thinking about how is your life dramatically different than it was before in a way that you can convince an auditor by clear and convincing evidence, the high burden that you mentioned, that you've actually changed your domicile. Because they're looking for that change.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the other joke I hear a lot around our office is, well, what do you have to do to move? You got to actually move, right? So you want to change your domicile, you got to move to another state. I can do that. I can keep connections in New York, but it's got to be kind of apparent, right? It's got to be clear on the surface that, yeah, you really moved. You changed your life, right? There's not really any faking it. Mm-hmm. And, I've got another client right now. I think, Brandon, you might be working with him where, clients sometimes kind of question us on this stuff, right? So, is it really that hard? Is it that difficult? And this client's a really smart guy, young guy. He's about to sell his company next year. He does not want to pay, it's going to be the kind of income that wouldn't be taxed in New York if he wasn't a resident. And so he called and said, I want to change my residence. I said, okay, great. Where are you going? Well, I don't know, maybe Florida. We start talking, and it's he doesn't want to live in Florida. He wants to spend, I don't know. He's like, I'll go there. I'll get an apartment. I can spend some time there, but I really want to be overseas here. I really want to be in Texas doing this. I want to be in other places. And so I started talking to him about leave and land, and here's how it works, and burden of proof. And then he's like, well, how about send me some cases? Send me some cases. So I send him cases. Here's the Black case. Here's the Haney case. Here's Here's another case, like think about the Cook case, right, where taxpayers had somewhat difficult facts and won. And he was actually he read those, and I think he understood the fundamentals of what I was saying. But 2 of those cases are taxpayer wins, right? So it's
Right.
like, well, but this guy won and that guy won. And so I was trying to explain to him, yeah, but they lost the audit, right? They had to litigate the case and they had to have a judge rule in their favor. And that took a long time and a lot of money and a lot of stress. And what I'm telling you is if you do these other things and you're careful around these other areas, you win the audit. You don't have to litigate. I'm like, geez, why would we want to litigate? And then finally, Brandon, I think he's just doing the 30-day rule next year, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, in that context and, with some clients, sometimes the hard part for them is not leaving New York. Like they're able to break the lease of their New York City apartment. They're able to sell their place and they're able to pack up and get out of New York. But, it's the leave and the land test. So not only do they have to leave New York with the requisite intent to abandon their former New York City domicile, but they also have to land in their new claimed state of domicile with the intent to reside there permanently. And sometimes the landing part is difficult for people who are maybe making a move at the end of the year. Maybe they have more of a nomadic lifestyle. Maybe they want to spend some time internationally. They have places all throughout the U.S. So sometimes the hard part is really proving the move to the new state of domicile, not necessarily taking all those steps to abandon New York. So yeah, the New York's 30-day rule is a statutorily created safe harbor test where, if a taxpayer gets rid of their New York City permanent place of abode, New York State place of abode, proves that they have a place outside of New York for the full calendar year and spends less than 30 days in the state, then by definition, they are not taxed as New York residents. So sometimes, there's some safe harbor rules, the 30-day rule, as I just mentioned, the 548-day rule for people who are going to spend time internationally that are these specific carve-outs that can be, critical in cases where maybe a domicile change isn't necessarily in the cards.
I'm looking at, Joe, you brought this article in, the New York Times article from the other day, and the title of it is, Rich New Yorkers Are Again Threatening to Leave. Here's Why They Don't. It's an interesting title. I think I would say they often do. But that's an example of a guy, he was probably leaving New York, but could we get comfortable you're landing in Florida? Probably not. From a residency standpoint, that means you're still technically a, quote, New Yorker, right? So that guy ends up being a New Yorker who's not paying tax, right? So rich New Yorkers are threatening to leave. He's leaving. He's not really changing his domicile, but there's this other way he sort of, again, statutory exception where he gets out of paying tax in a year where he's going to liquidate his company. It's like a big income year for him.
Here's the article for the folks at home. Those are our colleagues, Mark Klein and Tim Noonan.
Well, we'll have to hear from Tim about, who else has had their picture in the New York Times for the next 10 years.
Well, and it's an interesting point about the title, whether it's, true or not to, that rich New Yorkers sometimes not making the move. And I think the point of the article itself is that we often have conversations with clients and, go through the audit process with them, where sometimes hearing about the audit process is enough to scare them away from the idea of moving because, to your point, Drew, sometimes they realize they don't actually want to move. They just want some magic tax fix and they don't want to do the work to actually get out of town. But sometimes it's that they, go through the audit process and they get hung up for a couple of years sometimes. We call it, the exit tax of, maybe you're audited for a 3-year period and New York is going to look at a change of domicile date that's after whatever you reported on your tax returns, and maybe you're clipped for an extra year of tax or an extra 2 years. So to the extent that, you tried to leave and New York pulled you back in, that meme of, from Godfather 3 that we put in all of our presentations.
Guilty.
It creates an interesting dynamic of, folks who maybe start out this process when they call us at the beginning that have a change of heart or at least have a changed view of what's actually going to need to be done. One of my favorite things that I hear from clients all the time, especially in the audit context, is like, but it was my intent to be a Floridian. I intended it. It's like, okay, it's like Michael Scott shouting, "I declare bankruptcy." In that episode of The Office, like you can't just shout, "I intended it," and have a New York auditor go, "Okay, you know what? We agree."
Well, because the auditors are going to say, all right, I can't know that that's true. I'll grant you that that's your intention, but like now prove to me that you took actions consistent with that intention, right? And that's where like you got to walk the walk to make it work. Having the intention alone's not enough. I think it was a mediator one time who like heard my client, kind of explain their intentions on why they, were Floridians, and she looked at them and said, "Well, I could intend to be domiciled on the moon, but that doesn't mean that I am, right? Even if it's my intention, right?" So it's like, yeah, your intentions are important, but they're probably going to grant you that and then say your actions aren't, by our estimation, consistent with that intention.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, when you consider how subjective of a test, New York's domicile test is, where, there's these objective factors that New York is looking at under the tax law and trying to match up those factors and the taxpayer's objective actions to get inside the taxpayer's head. You see highlighted in the article the examples of all the pitfalls where, people fell just short of proving their change of domicile. Things like, their fishing license comes up, the location of burial plots, the locations of pets, and all these things sound so silly, but when you're kind of looking at the mosaic of a taxpayer's life and where they intend to be and where their state of residence is, like all those things kind of get baked in, and that's why there's going to be different of those specific facts for each person that are ultimately going to be pretty critical in the analysis of their domicile.
Yeah, I think your point about like these little facts that sometimes come up, like a burial plot, for example, when we're talking to new clients and going through, especially if they're already in the audit context, how often do you get asked, like, are they really going to ask about that? Are they really going to look at that? How will they know where I was? Like, first of all, like Google exists and AI now exists to enhance whatever supercomputers they have at their disposal to like search public records, which were already not that hard to find to begin with. Like the answer often to, are they going to ask me some very intrusive question or look at a very intimate part of my life when examining a change of domicile, is yes, they are. And they can, and they have every right to, because you have made a claim on, a legal document, your tax return. And they're going to, use whatever tools they have at their disposal to investigate whether that claim is accurate. Now, that doesn't mean every single person's going to have, a New York State auditor going through their trash outside to be like, this trash doesn't look very Floridian. Not a lot of palm trees and flip-flops being thrown out by these folks.
Check in the closet for the amount of Tommy Bahama shirts in there.
Exactly. They're not going to call up your country club and say, how many rounds did they play this year in New York? But they might ask for your statements.
They can look at the Gin app too.
Yeah, exactly. We've used the Gin app before if you are a golfer, make sure you're actually, registering those tee times, because that can become very important proof in your tax residency case.
Yeah. You're saying we have to audit your handicap app now, Joe?
Yeah, post all your scores.
Yeah. I've got some friends who I'd like to audit their handicap. I'll tell you what. But it's an interesting aspect of this that, like, it's very personal. It's your life and your livelihood, and they're going to ask you questions about your children and your family and your spending habits and where you were on every single day. And sometimes that freaks people out. Yeah,
it's intensely personal, right?
Yes.
So it's like these things come up in the audit context, and maybe not in every audit, right? Well, the auditors are people too. They're often not very comfortable asking the kinds of personal questions that we're describing. They're going to dance around it a little bit. But in the planning context, it's like I want to understand all these things, right? I want to dig very deep. And so like I'm asking our clients intensely personal questions on the front end. I want to understand all the facts. I want to know what they are. I want to be able to advise accordingly, right? And every client's got a kind of different, specificity to their case that's different than the other person. And we got to advise them accordingly, right? So it's important for sure.
And a lot of the times it's that very intimate nature that stops people from going all the way to litigation. It's all fun and games while it's in the audit context, but sometimes people don't want to get up on the stand and testify about
Yeah.
very private details of their life.
Yeah, and that could be just because it makes them uncomfortable. It could be because, geez, everyone's got certain things they don't want anyone else knowing, right? And if this has to be part of my tax case and I got to do it at a hearing where there's going to be a public decision, right? Like, sure, sometimes people will make that kind of decision.
And it all comes back to the context and the catalyst for this conversation, which is, if you have been watching television and you heard that Mr. Mamdani is going to raise New York City tax rates and you're concerned about that, you need to be aware of what might be involved if you want to both make a move and then the audit of that move after the fact, because often there's already some unpleasantness with counseling people on making the move sometimes. So all the things we've discussed already of like, yes, you're actually going to have to spend a lot of time in Florida or Texas. You might have to be there in the summer when it's really, really hot. You know why? Because an auditor is going to assume that like people spend time in the summer where they actually live.
Yeah, you know who spends time in Florida in the summer? Floridians.
Yes. There's just no shortcuts. I feel like people all the time want us to have some sort of like magic bullet for how they can make their residency change. Like they're going to engage us, and then after the consultation call, once they've engaged, we're going to be like, and now here's the secret that we didn't tell you before. No, all we're going to do is be like, well, we told you what it was before, and now just actually carry out what I am telling you to do to make this change. Yes, you actually have to move your stuff from New York to Florida.
Yeah. Now let's dive deep, right?
Yes.
Because now I want to tell you, I gave you a sense of what you need to do, right, to make this move. And now I want to understand everything about your life so I can tell you, here are those specific things you have to change, right? So, yeah, it becomes that deep dive.
Yeah, and I think for clients who do have some level of flexibility and, are willing to listen to our advice and follow our advice and put together a cogent plan around their move. I mean, Drew, I've been in your office on calls where I've heard clients say, wow, like I want to get audited and I want to get this over with.
Yeah, because then there's certainty, right? So yeah, I think for a lot of people it's a sacrifice, right? Like this is a lot. There's a lot of things I have to do when I want to keep a place in New York. It's kind of a delicate balancing of a whole bunch of different connections, and so I think it weighs on people, right? I got to be really careful over the next several years and do this in a way that is right and that makes sense. And then, to Brandon's point, there's like sometimes some relief when the audit comes. Oh, finally, I get this over with, right? I can prove to these people I really moved, and then I can take a deep breath, right? There's just a sense of relief, which sounds kind of silly. Like no one wants to be audited, but a lot of our clients, they're not like screaming with excitement when the audit notice comes, but they're like, oh, okay, this is great. Now I can get the audit over and done with.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of that, I don't want to say living in fear of the audit, because I don't know that it's keeping people up at night, like, fear of something else, but definitely a sense of apprehension of like, what auditor am I going to get? What questions are they going to ask me? All of the time we spend prepping them for it, it's going to be an intimate look at your life. That's probably what keeps a lot of people concerned. Or the thought of, well, what if, we get the question asked all the time, what if I lose? Am I going to go to jail? You're not going to go to jail. In most circumstances, you're not going to go to jail. It's a fraud, still a thing.
Yeah, I don't think it's a good point. Certainly, like anytime there's a criminal tax case, it makes the news. I don't certainly have never seen any of our residency cases go criminal, right? Like if you go into it with the best intentions, it's an intentions-based test. Like even if you don't satisfy an auditor that you met the burden of proof, this is a tax thing, right? Like you're going to owe some money. So you owe the taxes you would have had to pay. There's some interest, maybe there's some penalties. I mean, we get into these battles with New York over cases that they deem to be unclear, right? You haven't met this high burden of proof. And those are the kinds of cases that often settle, right? So, when I'm talking to people about, well, what's the worst case? Well, okay, we're talking in the planning context. I'm giving you advice. Try to follow the advice. If you don't, there's risk, right? You go into this with your eyes open. If you don't follow the advice very closely and you get audited, they might not agree you moved. And then, we might have to argue with them, right? It might take longer than it would otherwise take. We might have to settle as opposed to just winning the case if you follow the advice, right?
Yeah, and I think in the in the case of people who do tax planning before they actually make their move and before they're audited, an important part of this discussion too is like, just because you have done the planning and listened to all our advice and executed all our advice, like, still doesn't mean it's a slam dunk, just because like auditors ask follow-up questions. Like, they are also doing a job whereby they have to get a certain amount of information from you to determine like whether you've actually done what you said you were going to do. And we certainly find that often if you've gone through planning, it makes things less painless, typically less follow-up, usually better results. But past results do not guarantee future success, as we would say.
Yeah, and to your point a few minutes ago, like, which particular audit group and audit office pull the audit, right? There is, unfortunately, I think a great deal of like inconsistency in how one audit group might view a particular set of facts versus another, right? So it's always hard to predict exactly how it's going to go.
Yeah, I mean, they're all fact by fact, case by case basis, and we do enough of these that we have a general sense of what is going to work and be persuasive and what is not going to work or what is going to create doubt in a case. But every single one is independent, and that's what creates some of the difficulty with these moves is, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. It's just not as simple as 6 months in a day and get a Florida license. Like, you're showing a change from your former lifestyle to your new lifestyle, a change that must be clear and convincing, which is, I always say when we do these speeches, like, there's not a hard and fast percentage to it, but assume 75, 80% of that scale needs to tip toward Florida.
Yeah, way better than 50-50, right?
Yes.
Can't be a coin flip. It's got to be much stronger. How much stronger? Hard to say. But yeah, like, ideally much, much stronger.
Which I recently had a oh my God moment of realization of like most civil litigation is just like 51%. Like, if you are preponderance of the evidence, like, get to that 51% and like you'll probably win most jury trials. So clear and convincing like kind of sucks for taxpayers.
We'd be killing audits if we only had to prove by a preponderance.
We'd be dominating.
Yeah, people wouldn't need us if it was that simple. And I think a lot of this conversation too, when we're talking about percentages with respect to the burdens of proof of proving the move, like, a lot of times I think it also boils down to when a taxpayer is kind of deciding what they want to do is their own risk tolerance. Like, sometimes on the front of moves, we'll advise a taxpayer, maybe they don't want to spend as much time as we want them to in the new state. And so it becomes kind of a game of like, look, like, you can do this and you can claim the move and it's defensible, but, maybe we're not, certain you're going to be at the clear and convincing standard. Maybe it's, at that point it's a little bit of a bargain and you kind of roll the dice. And some taxpayers are willing to do that. Other taxpayers, they want to spend 300 days and sell their New York place. And it's like, you might not even need us at that point.
Yeah, the assumption of risk or the risk tolerance point is a good one. I've found in my tenure that tax attorneys tend to have less of an appetite for risk than tax accountants do. And that's often an interesting dichotomy at the start of any of these planning processes or audit processes are like, accountants tend to be a little more aggressive in their risk tolerance, and attorneys tend to be more conservative in our approach to things. And then seeing where clients fall is always, interesting.
Yep.
But I think something that is unique to this specific conversation. We've been talking a lot about moving to Florida or moving to Texas, but this is obviously a hike to New York City's resident tax rates, which for those of you that are not longtime listeners of the show or who are unfamiliar with how things work in New York State, it's an all or nothing income tax rule. You're either a resident of New York City and taxed at their residential rates, or you're not, and you don't pay any tax to New York City, unlike New York State's rates, which you continue to pay New York State tax even as a non-resident if you have source income. So, you don't need to pack up everything and go down to Florida. If you are someone who's watching what's going on and thinking like, man, I got to get out of the city, you can go to Long Island. You can go to Westchester. You can go to Buffalo. Yeah,
I mean, the considerations will be wildly different, right? Because there's a lot of people who are very connected to the city for business, right? I'm an employee. I work in the city. I have a business based in the city. I maybe, just practically speaking, can't move to Florida. And I've chosen to live in New York City because it's convenient for me and, I'm paying the tax. But, geez, as the city rate goes up, maybe I think about moving to Westchester, moving to New Jersey, moving out to Long Island, moving to Connecticut, like all places that are still commuting distance from the city. Lots and lots of people live in those places and come into work in the city every day. Those people don't live in the city, they don't pay the tax, right? So I think we're going to see an increasing number of people who might not historically have considered moving, right? I want to live in New York, and maybe I need to live in New York. But geez, I can live somewhere that's proximate to New York City, manage all that, and not pay city tax, especially if the rate's going to, go up by 50%.
Yeah, and the city tax audits are like, in my opinion, kind of a whole different kettle of fish, and like the various challenges that arise in the audit context. Like for us, so many of our clients keep a place in New York City, even if they're moving just from out of the city to upstate or downstate. Like you said, often there is a remaining business connection such that like the business factor might be a loser. So you limit the number of things you can change and focus on to have an impactful change of domicile. I mean, it's very possible. Again, this is something we do all the time, but it's not like going to Florida and being able to say, like, I wasn't even in New York.
Yeah. Just makes balancing all the other factors that much more important, right? Yeah. Like where I have a client who wants to move anywhere, right? I'm leaving the city, I'm moving anywhere, but my business is still based here, right? And I can't change that for whatever reason. Okay, the business factor is going to favor New York City, right? That's one of the 5 primary factors. We got to balance everything else in a way that we're really comfortable that it's still compelling, right? And so there's going to be probably less flexibility around what can I do with my various homes? How much time can I still spend in the city, right? We got to be really careful on those factors to make those other cases work, right? To balance it appropriately. But getting back to the, kind of Mamdani part of this and like looking at the title of that article, I think the statistics would say otherwise, right? Like even put aside the proposed increase to the rate, if you look at the statistics, number one, people are leaving. Population goes down year over year. The census data tells us that. Yeah. Number two, when you dig into the statistics, and various people have studied this and put out reports over the last couple of years, generally more people leaving in the highest income brackets.
Yes, the like millionaires that are leaving in those reports are for the most part have been increasing year over year since COVID, maybe a slight decline, in some of the years, but yeah. They're leaving en masse.
So I just, when I hear like, well, there, people in, Mamdani's camp are not worried people are going to leave, I think they will. And I think people of very high income levels that leave, for every one of those taxpayers that leaves New York City, that tax is not easily replaced. That person's paying a lot of city tax. And even if other people move in, is it going to replace that tax? It probably isn't. And we've got, you've got all those proposals and, merits of the proposals aside, if we have to have more revenue to pay for those proposals, and a lot of the revenue in New York is driven by personal income tax, it just, it puts, I think, it puts them in a difficult place, right? Because if people are encouraged to leave, and to your point, the city tax is all or nothing. If I leave, I don't pay it. Tax dollars walk out the door, and then how do I get where I need to be from a revenue standpoint?
And it's a huge risk from the perspective of you're basically using this hike as a major part to fund other policy points, which are all public service initiatives. Will you have a handful of folks who look at those things and say, yes, I'm happy to pay, more money to improve the various New York City public services around me because I live here and I'm a proud New Yorker? That's fine. But a lot of folks are not going to see it that way. Part of the problem will be they may already have a distrust that their tax dollars are being spent appropriately to begin with. Why would it be better if they're paying more money?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think people are always going to be motivated by taxes, whether it's the main motivation or not. And it becomes a particularly important motivation for them when there's a big income event, right? And so, yeah, I think these kinds of topics are not going away. And, you know, I don't think it gets a lot of sympathy. You're not going to get sympathy from people when you think about, you know, rich people paying more taxes. And you look at like that California thing that's come out. I think the coverage I've seen says it would theoretically affect 200 to 300 people. So it's like, okay, that's not a big category of people, but the whole proposal is to raise revenue by imposing a big tax on 200 to 300 people.
Right.
And the whole tax is driven by them living in California. Those are exactly the kind of people who could just decide to move. Maybe they won't. They love California. They want to stay. But they walk out the door, and now you've lost them because of that proposal, and you've also lost all the income tax they're otherwise paying. So I think, you know, these proposals and, you know, they come out and people say, oh, they're not going to leave. They don't leave. It's not universally true. Not everyone's going to leave, right? But enough people will that it will make an impact.
Yeah, I mean, we were getting phone calls as soon as Mamdani won the primary. Like, people they're going to leave. They just are. Maybe it won't be as many as we think it might be, but, you know, based on some of the comments that were coming out of the mayor's camp during the election, it's probably going to be more than they're anticipating.
Yeah, and I think it's a simple reality, like whether or not it's purely motivated by Mamdani taking office or just these people are going to leave anyway, like it's just a reality that people are going to leave. So that's just something the state needs to be prepared for, you know, whether or not, you know, whatever the motivations truly are.
You know, Brandon, you and I have talked about how there is potential here for kind of a secondary mass exodus of folks that we just saw as it relates to COVID.
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of the times in our practice, we think about kind of the macro trends that affect, you know, kind of the general psyche of New Yorkers, and in this case, you know, high net worth New York City taxpayers, and what those events kind of drive people to do. Like, you know, 5 years ago at this point, we were talking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and, you know, people wanting to get out of the city, whether it be, you know, for health reasons or, you know, to avoid the pandemic or whatever that may be. But that led to kind of a mass exodus of taxpayers. And now 5 years later, like, you know, kind of comparing the impact of that versus, you know, now we have a new mayor in New York City with you know, kind of a set of policy goals and objectives that, you know, some people are nervous about. So, you know, just kind of comparing those two events and how it might affect, you know, the people wanting to leave New York City is just, you know, I think interesting to monitor, especially in our practice when we see these types of events, you know, impact our business and you know, taxpayers in this state.
Yeah, we'll find out. I mean, we'll maybe do this 5 years from now, revisit and look back and say, hey, did it result in a similar spike to exits the way that we saw in COVID?
Yeah, I'll be interested to see how it pans out. Maybe we'll be wrong. Maybe no one will leave and New York City will generate hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in tax revenue and have a new renaissance. Or maybe they will drive out a whole bunch of multimillionaires and the problem will be, you know, much worse than they are right now. I don't know. I can't tell the future. All I know is what we've seen from past trends. And what we do know is people move for tax reasons. Well, guys, thanks for joining me today for the first ever video podcast. I mean, this was awesome.
Breaking new ground today, Joe.
Yeah, it's like I said, it was as good of a time as any to put our faces on camera. Not that you can't see our pictures on the website, but it's new territory. I think that there'll be more of this going forward. So I assume these will be on YouTube and on our website. Or I don't know if you can watch a full video podcast on LinkedIn, but if you're really wasting time during your day or trying to educate yourself about New York's rules, you know, check us out.
Well, and if it goes gangbusters, you might retire as a state and local tax lawyer and just become a YouTube influencer.
I would love to be a SALT influencer. I feel like, you know, that market hasn't been cornered yet. Why not me? Why not us? We could just be, you know, the bar stool of tax. All right. Well, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you as always for tuning in to State Tax Talks with Joe Tantillo. I've been your host, Joe Tantillo. Thank you again to my colleagues, Brandon Bourg and Drew Wright, for joining. Until the next time, if you have tax questions, feel free to reach out to us. Otherwise, we'll be back to fill the airwaves and I guess now the telewaves, whatever the equivalent is for video, with our tax knowledge because it brings us great joy. So thanks again, and we'll see you real soon. If you're interested in listening to more episodes, we're available on all platforms where podcasts can be found, including YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode of State Tax Talks with Joe Tantillo, please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're in need of a tax professional, you can contact the tax attorneys at Hodgson Russ. Go to www.hodgsonruss.com for more information. And until next time, I'm Joe Tantillo, and this is State Tax Talks. Catch you later, tax fans. The comments contained in this podcast do not constitute legal advice. The opinions herein are the opinions of the speakers and not the official opinion of the Hodgson Russ Law Firm.